the appeal to a class interest requires actually the at least sketching out of an alternative social order, which makes it very different from the appeal to market interests. If you go all the way back to Lukács, right? What's his central message? Class consciousness is a consciousness of class, meaning that coming to an understanding of one's class interests is at the same time coming to an understanding that one holds a specific kind of structural position in the whole society. And at the same time, coming to an understanding that we could have different kinds of societies, right? So this is why it's so difficult to achieve, right? Because the most immediate economic interests are those that are given on the market, and they're the most obviously appealable to, right? Class interests require the at least intuition that there's a different sort of society that is possible. This is also why when we speak of the emergence of class interest or an awareness of class, it also requires us to understand that in the context of a specific state of class struggle. That is to say, it is not the case that classes have interests over which they subsequently struggle. It is the case that classes come to understand, and this is particularly true for wage earners, they come to understand their interests as a class in the context of a class struggle.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le Bunga-Bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le Bunga-Bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le Bunga-Bunga.
Welcome back to Bunga-Cast. I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil, joined by contributing editor Lee Jones in London. Now, what is the connection between the evolution of capitalism since the 1980s and the structure of politics that's emerged in the rich world, particularly in the US, since the financial crisis of 2007-8? That's a question in its different permutations that we've been looking to answer on Bunga-Cast since we started 9 years ago. But those words in specific belong to Dylan Riley, who's our guest today. Dylan Riley is professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with his work. Welcome, Dylan.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's great to talk to you guys both.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you back. It's been over 3 years since you were last on, and I'm very eager to discuss what we're going to be discussing today. Now, for those who don't know, Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner set off, I think, one of the most concentrated and serious debates on the left in recent times with their essay 7 Theses on American Politics, published in 2022 in the New Left Review. Possibly the most contentious claim, or the one that generated the most debate, regarded the emergence of so-called political capitalism. But the essay also dealt with crucial political consequences emerging from the reality of low-growth capitalism, of secular stagnation, and in particular the material but non-class politics that has emerged, especially but not only in the US. And we're going to inquire into all of that. So we're going to start by talking a bit about political capitalism. We'll then move on to some, I think, geo-economic aspects, as people now like to refer to it as, before concluding on the politics of the matter, both in the US and indeed perhaps beyond that. So, Dylan, to get started, you write, political leaders and capitalists have quite openly allied in promoting new practices to appropriate the surplus product. We have termed, this is you and Robert Brenner writing, we have termed the resulting combination, still taking shape, political capitalism. So what do you mean by political capitalism, and what are its main features?
It's a great question. Let me just, maybe the way of getting into that most effectively is to begin with what we could say is, classical capitalism or non-political capitalism, and then develop the notion of political capitalism by contrast to that. So I want to just say that the reason that I think you could say the reason that we care about capitalism, the reason that it's such a distinctive sort of system of social production, is that in a capitalist economy, you have firms that are competing on price with one another. And as they compete on price, they attempt to increase the productivity of labor by investing in machinery and means of production to produce their commodities at a lower price than their competitors. And this has been the key to achieving really what we call economic growth. Sometimes economists call it modern economic growth or other things of that sort. And the key idea is that, in a sense, capitalists as a group, as an ownership class, have been historically distinctive in depending largely on reaping the gains of productivity as the basis of, sort of their profits, or their surplus. And we could say that, you know, our intuition, that is to say, Brenner and mine's intuition, is that something began to change at a very deep level around about 1980 in this kind of strategy of you could say profit seeking. And what changed was largely that investment in actual, machinery and organization of production, investment in those kinds of things that really increased productivity became less important as a source of surplus. And what really stepped into its place, largely, I would say, are a series of strategies to manipulate the prices of assets and particularly to increase their value without investment in means of production. And so it was a kind of a form of profitability that really was based on what you could think of as asset price inflation. And this asset price inflation itself rested on a set of basically political mechanisms and primarily the policies of central banks, but not just central banks, also tax policies and other things of that sort. And what these had the effect of doing was allowing for asset prices to appreciate and therefore allowing capitalists to, reap the gains of that appreciation without investing in production. And you saw that it manifests itself, we could say, in the rich world, primarily through declining rates of investment and ultimately in slower economic growth. And this is a kind of new regime. That's kind of what we're suggesting. Now, there are lots of other things that are going on here. There are other kinds of ripoffs, but that's kind of the central mechanism that I'd like to really emphasize.
I think this has probably been the most controversial aspect of your original essays, the idea of political capitalism, the label, the idea that it constitutes a new regime of accumulation within capitalism. I'd just like to push you a bit on it. So, why choose the term political capitalism? I mean, some people would say this is a kind of contradiction in terms, particularly if we think about the way that Robert Brenner himself historically understood capitalism and distinguished it from feudalism as being about the extraction of surplus value from workers through non-political or purely economic means.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, it looks like political capitalism is a contradiction in terms, or is no longer capitalism itself. And a kind of related question would be, you claim in the article that raw political power rather than productive investment is the key determinant of the rate of profit, I think. Is that really true? That it's the key determinant, raw political power? It could be that it's a more important one at particular moments in time. It's become more important over the past 20 years. But is it really true to say it's the key determinant?
Yeah, no, I think those are both quite good questions. On the first one, I think there has been some discussion about whether, oh well, we all know that Robert Brenner defined capitalism in terms of market dependence and largely in terms of an orientation to profitability based upon investment in means of production and the reaping of productivity gains. And he distinguished that sharply from other forms of exploitation that were based on broadly political mechanisms. What I would just say with respect to that is I don't think there was anything in Brenner's analysis per se that suggested that the typically capitalist strategy of attempting to, appropriate a surplus by capturing productivity gains would be an eternal system. In fact, I mean, if you look carefully at the economics of global turbulence, there is a very important discussion of the period of sort of the secular stagnation of the 1930s, really, that suggests that without the intervening factor of the Second World War, it's possible that a new kind of system could have emerged, a kind of form of political capitalism that would have come earlier. So I'm not sure I'm not sure exactly that Brenner himself would hold on to the idea that that a capitalism once so defined continues in that way forever. The term itself, of course, doesn't come from Brenner at all. It's really something that Weber first discusses in a different context, really in the context of the merchant capitalists of the 16th and 17th century. It's then taken up again by Gabriel Kolko, who is a kind of, I would say, a heterodox Marxo-Weberian kind of political economist and historian. And it was first used actually to discuss precisely the kind of slowdown of the late 20s in the U.S. and the deep connections between political power and accumulation that emerged then. So it might be best to think about political capitalism as a phase that sort of comes and goes at different periods in the overall life cycle of capitalism. That's at least one hypothesis that I think would be worth considering. In terms of your second question, which is, well, what is the actual role of politics in this sense, and how dependent is capitalism now on political power? Isn't there a kind of a lot of productive investment in capital at this moment? I think the strongest piece of evidence in support of that position is what's going on right now with AI. That is to say, the huge investments that are being made in order to build out largely the data infrastructure upon which this new technology is going to be based, and which, as we know, accounted for the vast majority of what growth there has been, at least in the US economy, over the past year or so, actually. And what I would say is that I think, first of all, I don't think it's at all clear whether that particular investment boom is likely to generate a sustained cycle of productivity growth. I think that we just don't know, to be quite honest with you. And there's a lot of evidence that this is really going to create a serious problem of overcapacity. We already see that, and worries. You read the Financial Times; people are continuously worrying about whether or not this is really a real problem of overinvestment in the sector that's unfolding. So that's one thing that I would kind of stick a pin in. The other more conceptual note would be to say, I would agree with you, Lee, at least at the implicit suggestion, which is that, well, maybe the best way to think about this is as a kind of combined system in which the political element is becoming more important, whereas we could say, productive investment element of capitalism is becoming less important. I think that's a reasonable position to hold. I still think that the change is very important to mark, primarily because I think it's how it puts some pretty severe constraints on politics, which was really the ultimate point of the essay. And it puts constraints on politics which are just of a completely different nature than those that define the politics of, particularly of the 30 glorious years after the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're in an interesting period, and perhaps different from one which we would have remarked upon maybe 10 years ago, in regards to the levels of investment. I mean, R&D spending, for example, has increased rather significantly in the past 10 years. And I was actually just looking at a chart earlier today, which was posted on the capital expenditure on data centers, which in kind of absolute terms, even inflation adjusted, vastly exceeds in its short history that which was spent on the railways, the interstate highway system, etc. Even adjusted or even put in relation to GDP, spending as a percentage of GDP, it's still enormous what they're spending on the capital expenditure on data centers. So I mean, that's interesting, but we're already 40 years into the ICT revolution with little to show for it in terms of increases in productivity. So I guess we'll have to see, obviously, with regard to AI. That's not a question which we're going to be able to, or even setting out to answer here. The question I did want to ask, though, is the fact that I think theoretically there's a lot of different theorists who are all seizing upon the same phenomenon and attempting to explain it. And specifically, I mean here, secular stagnation and the upwards transfer of wealth through asset inflation and rents, often politically enabled, and the social and political implications of this, which are, I mean, we could list probably more than what I'm about to, but for starters, patrimonial politics, racketeering, widening inequality, and perhaps also a diffuse sense of social decay. And, I think in a way we're all trying to grapple with this. We've had this debate on this podcast plenty of times over several years now about decay, about decline, stagnation, various different ways of conceptualizing it. One theory is that we're regressing to feudal relations, but in a high-tech environment, which is to say techno-feudalism, which indeed you kind of gesture at in your writings on this. How does political capitalism differ from this? We've done recent episodes on techno-capitalism. I've written about it myself, and kind of interested to see where you align and where you differ.
Alex, did you say techno-capitalism or techno-feudalism?
If I said techno-capitalism, that was a slip of the tongue. Techno-feudalism.
Techno-feudalism. Okay. Yeah.
But techno-capitalism is fairly uncontentious.
Well, there's so many things floating around. I want to make sure I know what I'm
that's almost
about.
redundant. It's not necessary to say techno-capitalism. Techno-feudalism.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so first of all, I think that what I appreciate in the work on techno-feudalism, and I guess I'm thinking particularly of the work, obviously, of Varoufakis and Durand. Sort of those are my primary, I would say, people that I think about in this world. I think what's useful about that work is that it's trying to account for something that is really new, and there's an attempt to periodize and to think about what the real economic constraints of the new politics are. But the more I've thought about the techno-feudalist thesis, as I understand what is being said there, is that there's a way in which technology platforms are being used to extract rents, and not just obviously from workers, but actually primarily from, you could say, from capitalists. Because, I mean, if you think about something like Amazon, basically the idea there is that people are trying to enter the marketplace, and then they're paying rents to the owners of the platforms in order to access the market. And the idea, I guess, presumably, is that these, I think this is the idea of a platform rent, or, that these things are kind of like, they have some relationship to the idea of a kind of a feud that can, you can use to extract rents from the entire population that has to participate in that market. So my position on this is, I think that is undoubtedly happening, but I guess I have a difficult time distinguishing that from, let's say, the rents that people had to pay to set up their shops in a mall, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't. I find it difficult to really to identify what's specifically new about that process. Although I would grant that it's perhaps more widespread now, and I grant that the process they're describing is a real one. So that's one concern I have. The other thing that a lot of people from the techno-feudalist world, I guess that Zuboff is the one who emphasizes this the most, is this idea that, well, we're producing this information that is being kind of appropriated for free through these technological platforms, and that this is a kind of serf-like relationship of exploitation, and that what's really new is that information has become the sheer collection of information has become a central part of the valuation of these companies. Again, I think it's undeniably true what's being said, but it's not clear to me that it is qualitatively different from what was going on in the 1950s on Madison Avenue and running market research surveys.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, information for purposes of marketing is not particularly new in the post-war period. So I'm not sure that the techno-feudal thesis is quite capturing what is really distinctive. And I guess it seems to me that what is really distinctive is, really beginning in around 1980, is just an absolute commitment to the use of the state to support the inflation of asset prices as a basis for accumulating vast amounts of wealth. And I also think that reorientation of the state toward that purpose has been enormously politically consequential. And so that's kind of my view. So I wouldn't deny that the processes that the techno-feudalist thesis describes are real. I think they are real and they're well described. But I would demur from a description of that as a real sort of as constituting a real phase, in the sense that I would like to talk about that, if that's clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I follow that on similar lines, that I don't have much to quibble with on empirical grounds with the techno-feudal theorists. I think the reference to feudalism, even if it's more of a mediatic sort of thing than any serious claim, because the differences are so fundamental. Even if we want to reduce things, as Varoufakis does, to rent over profit, even there, it's not right, and that also mischaracterizes a lot of else of what was going on in feudalism, the unique nature of modernity, etc., and so on. But what I think it does get us to, and again, dealing with the reality of a kind of stagnant capitalism, is the grappling with really existing capitalism versus what we understand theoretically in a kind of Marxist framework as, a kind of pure capitalism, as kind of this universalizing force, versus the much more particularistic forms that it often takes, particularly outside the core. And I think so there's theorists, and I kind of follow this line of thinking, emphasizing peripheralization, which is to say that really existing capitalism outside the core has always relied more on direct extraction, more dependent on the state, redder in tooth and claw, etc., and that this is what is now happening in the core. And now the reasons for that, I think, are perhaps more difficult to explain. But I wonder what your feelings were on that reading of things.
I think that's a really interesting reading of things. That's what my feelings are on that. The way I would put it might be slightly different than the way you're putting it, but it would primarily, what I would say is that I think that, the way, obviously capitalism is a global system. And it imposes and has historically imposed on those who are in, what is called the periphery or the semi-periphery, certain strategies of adaptation, which have tended to reinforce political modes of extraction, right? I mean, one thing that I think, one example of this, I think that's, really interesting is, of course, Chico de Oliveira's idea of the platypus economy, for example, as a description of Brazil. I mean, there's just an undeniable kind of reality to that. And then I think what you're suggesting is that, well, perhaps really what's happening is that this thing that had been long described as particular to peripheral capitalism has somehow come into the core of the capitalist system and has begun to erode that system from within. To which I would say, I think there is a potentially very useful way of thinking about what is happening. I do think, however, that we ought to hold quite firmly to an understanding that what was particular to capitalism, and what has been historically particular to capitalism, is this combination of profit-seeking activity with an tendency to increase the productivity of labor. That is to say, profit-seeking plus rapid economic growth. That's a distinctive thing. And to the extent that that's unraveling, it's quite important to understand why that is. I think it's less useful to say, well, just capitalism has always kind of been, has always been kind of rapacious and extractive. And this whole idea that, real capitalism is productive and other kinds of capitalism are not. I don't think that's that useful. I think it's important to hold on to the distinction between these things, partly for understanding the nature of politics in the core of the capitalist world, partly for understanding the periodization that we're going through since the 1980s, and partly to understand the way that capitalism has operated as a global system, which obviously has very much not been manifested by a smooth and friction-free extension of the system from its sort of core areas to its non-core areas, but rather has created huge obstacles to the extension of that system. That's been the nature of it, if that makes sense.
No, sure. I guess it's just and to, I guess, refer to Lee's question in a way that these are matters of relative degree. The degree to which there's predation versus typical economic exploitation, and to what extent each element is, is a greater or less means of extracting surplus, varied across space, right? And the fundamental central thing might still be economic exploitation, but in certain places and times you get more predation, and whether that justifies then saying that now in our times that something has changed qualitatively, or the quantity has changed the quality to the extent that we can refer to it as now political capitalism, or something like that. And I think also we have to perhaps deal with a seeming paradox, and maybe we don't have to maybe dwell on this question, but it does come to mind that seeming sort of paradox that once you have capitalism as it's an entirely global and total system, from 1990s onwards, that you precisely begin to see these elements of stagnation and increasing predation. So it's something which, at least to me, seems paradoxical. Maybe
I mean, the way that I would explain that, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem, I think, is the key problem here is the problem of excess productive capacity. So as capitalism, has, I mean, the success, the extent that you could say capitalism is a system of production based on, to use the Marxist phrase, you could just say that based on relative surplus value, like that kind of capitalism. It of course, it breaks through, of course, in Europe in the 19th century. Then it goes to its North American kind of extension. And then the next really big success in terms of expanding that system, in my opinion, is really the East Asian economies in the 90s, right? But that has done really very little to solve actually some of the really fundamental problems of the system. What it has done is to layer another level of extremely competitive, productive capacity into an already clogged system, right? So the very things, the very process by which the system expands is slowing it down, as it were. It's slowing down its dynamism. And I think it has also, seems to me, it has made it much more difficult for the periphery and the semi-periphery to enter into the sort of high growth path, right? As the rest of the world, certainly the development of the East Asian economies have not spelled. They've obviously, this has created demand for agricultural exports, for example, from Brazil or other parts of Latin America, but it hasn't really spread industrialization in the Brazilian context. Nor has it been at all good, obviously, for the European economies. It's been a disaster, and I think they're getting ready for another wave of getting hit by this. So I don't know exactly where that leaves us, other than to say that capitalism as search for relative surplus value is a very important thing and distinctive element of what we want to talk about, and it not only does it not show much of a tendency to expand smoothly to all parts of the world, but its existence in one part of the world throws up barriers to the achievement of that kind of economic system in other parts of the world. This has been the story of what has been, if you look at it from any kind of long-term perspective, has been largely the failure of the kind of developmentalism and within a capitalist framework for decades, really.
Lee, I think you had a question about clear out.
I want to kind of bring the conversation back to the state, I suppose. And maybe if I can just sort of recap your argument for listeners who might not have read your articles on this. So as I understand it, your argument is, as you've just mentioned here, the international competition and overcapacity lead to diminishing returns to productive investment, so investment in manufacturing, particularly compared to investments in finance. And we know that finance and services have weak productivity growth. So overall, that means less investment in industry, meaning economic stagnation. And as you see it, capitalists are increasingly using the state to extract surplus through extracting tax cuts, corporate subsidies, low interest rates to prop up zombie companies. And you have this quite remarkable statistic. I think it's about 20% of American firms essentially can't pay down their capital. So they're kind of propped up in this way.
Right.
But you know that there are very kind of nasty political consequences arising from this, which we'll get to later on, which cause the state or cause political parties to want to do something about this, to reverse economic stagnation, to get growth going again. And you point to the last time that this happened with secular stagnation in the 1930s, and you point to efforts to do that through the New Deal, which got the economy going again, even if ultimately it was World War II that really resolved the deep crisis. But you say today this is not happening. So why isn't that? Why today do you think the state is not autonomous enough from capital to clear out the zombies, impose economic shocks, and start a new form of economic dynamism again?
Yeah. So I think that the short answer to that is that the working class is too weak and divided. That would be the shortest possible formulation of this. The longer formulation would be that, in general, right, this is a huge problem. It's very, very difficult. So let me try to distinguish between. There are sort of two difficulties, I think, with what we could broadly call the Keynesian project, right? One of them is that it depends, I think, on a militant working class of some sort pushing from below. And the other thing that it depends upon is an international system, which is fundamentally cooperative in some way to be really successful, right? Those two conditions, I think, were almost uniquely in place at the end of the Second World War. You had the American, hegemonic project, which, quite amazingly, in a way, opened its own markets to its competitors and created, for a period of time, a non-zero sum cooperation across the entire global economy. And you also had, of course, the experience of working class militancy from below in the U.S. and then following that in Europe in the post-war period. And this allowed for and also, of course, the fundamental thing that all the capital stock had been blasted out by the war, and you had a lot of slack in the system to create really, really dynamic rates of economic growth. So those things are all basically missing in the contemporary period. Now, I think what's really interesting is the Biden experiment in this regard. And I think the things I would say, I don't think it's something to be dismissed. I actually think that what Biden did, and especially in his first couple of years, or it should be said, it's probably better to say what the people around Biden were doing in the first couple of years, was quite ambitious. The thing that I'm impressed by, or by that group, is that they understood the problem and they tried to address it, and they tried to use the state to address it. Now, why could they do that? I think we can't overemphasize the importance of the COVID experience for sort of creating a possibility for doing this. It operated, in my view, as a kind of ersatz class struggle, remember, there was that whole period when suddenly neoliberalism, we were like, okay, we're forgetting that now, and the state can do anything it wants. So, and they showered the system with money. But what's, of course, you could say, I think, there may have been possibilities to extend that model, but there were two problems that I think were really, really evident from the very beginning. The first one was that the capacity of the US state to do much more than handing out resources to private industry was extremely low. It turned out that a lot of the Biden projects essentially went to kind of low-hanging fruit that could easily be, made profitable, but it did not. It didn't really. It wasn't. They weren't really able to restart the kind of investment boom that they wanted to, which you saw in this enormously large number of share buybacks that occurred during the Biden administration. So that was one constraint, was just the capacity of the U.S. state that had been hollowed out by neoliberalism over this long period. The other constraint, though, that I think is important is that the U.S.'s attempt to reindustrialize was immediately creating friction, geopolitical friction, and not just with China, but also with the European allies. I remember how upset the French were by the kind of various Buy American provisions that the Biden administration was putting on things, right? So the space for what we could call the Keynesian strategy, which relies on, to some degree, an autonomous state, but also relies on this kind of geopolitical system. But a kind of global system of international cooperation and hegemony. The space for that system is very, very narrow in the current period, and it's not clear to me how that can be broken through. That's what I would say.
That's interesting. I mean, I wanted to ask you a bit about Biden, so maybe we'll kind of bring that forward. So, I agree very much with what you've said, although I think on the international political space, I might quibble a bit there, because I think the Americans frankly didn't care, and they created some little loops for foreigners to participate in the IRA subsidized projects and so on. But frankly, they just stuck two fingers up to Europe and got on with it. I think that's less important for the United States. Probably what mattered for cooperation after World War II was more the idea that we were going to regulate capital and have an international monetary system, and that the Biden didn't do that, of course, and that's probably less thinkable today. But I suppose the more critical way to think about Bidenism, and we don't need to buy into any of the left's romantic, Green New Deal stuff and think that it was a great idea. It was obviously very kind of hedged and constrained in all kinds of ways. But I would question whether it's what Biden was trying to do is really consistent with the idea of political capitalism that you have sketched out, because the term that you and Robert Brenner use is rip-offs. Mm-hmm. And rent seeking and extraction, the idea that the capitalist class is able to basically use state power to pump up asset prices and that kind of thing, and not do productive investment. Whereas it seems to me what Bidenism was an attempt to do, all this stuff about foreign policy for the middle class and economic policy for the middle class, it was an attempt, like it was a political project. It was an attempt to win aspects of the working class back from Trump, because there was that kind of right-wing populist threat, and these people are terrified by it. It's not the same as a militant working class threat, granted, but it was a political project aimed squarely at the middle class, and Biden wanted to frame himself as the most pro-union president. So there clearly was a political tilt towards the working class, and an acceptance that these people had not won from globalization, and a lot of requirements of these sort of industrial projects in the CHIPS Act and so on, they must be located in poorer areas, and they must do these sort of political things. And secondly, it was aimed at fostering productive investment. Granted, a lot of it got slashed in by the neoliberals in the Senate, but the centerpiece of that is the CHIPS Act, and then there was the infrastructure stuff. Now, the rollout of that was very slow because of the lack of state capacity and various problems. Right, rebuilding an emaciated neoliberal state from where it is very, very difficult. But that seems to me, although it's constrained and problematic in all kinds of ways, and a lot of it was delivered through subsidies and tax breaks and that kind of thing, it does seem to me a substantively different project than the Bush tax cuts, or what Trump's doing with his big beautiful blah blah. And that seems more to be captured by the idea of state capitalism, which we've discussed on this podcast, particularly with Ilias Alami in episode 515. And state capitalism, as he understood it, is the increasing role of the state as a direct investor, a controller of capital, and one that uses muscular statism, as he calls it, industrial policy. And the Biden administration even used the words industrial policy, which is a kind of taboo in American politics. And he understands state capitalism as a tendency within capitalism, right? So the role the state does not play a consistent role historically. Sometimes it steps in, sometimes it steps back. It depends on conditions. And he sees this as a response to secular stagnation. So there's a considerable amount of overlap between your sort of descriptive analysis of where we are at the in terms of secular stagnation, but the policy response, with the state capitalist response, with what Biden was groping towards, and what a lot of other places are groping towards too, because this is a global phenomenon, not a US specific phenomenon, seems slightly different. So I suppose, what do you think of this idea of state capitalism? How does your concept relate to it? And what do you think of the Biden experiment in that context?
So I would just say, I mean, I guess my initial response is to say that the Biden experiment merits a lot of study. I would just say two things about it, basically. One is, I think it's very important to understand that the Biden experiment didn't work. And it failed. I think, on the one hand, yes, there was some investment, but obviously much less than they needed. It did nothing to win back the working class as they thought it was supposed to. And the other element of this that I think still merits further research, I may be coming off as a kind of right winger here, but I think inflation was partly an outcome of this, which is quite understandable in a context of political capitalism. Now, there are debates on that about whether the inflation was caused by supply chain problems or too much demand in the system. Nevertheless, the inflation was dramatic, real, and completely undermined the political basis of the Biden legacy. So I don't see. I guess I think I agree completely with the idea that what they were trying to do was to restart the engine of productive investment and so on. But it strikes me that it was not successful, and one reason for that is because they were operating in this system in which as we've talked about before, there's just this fundamental problem of excess capacity. It turns out to make much more sense for people to invest in assets and engage in financial speculation than it does to really engage in investment. Although I wouldn't deny that there was some investment, there was investment. And I also wouldn't deny what the Biden people were trying to do. I don't think that they were occult neoliberals who really wanted to hand out money to rich people. I don't think that's what was going on at all. I think they had basically this analysis that you're saying, but it just didn't work. And I guess, I think the concept of state capitalism probably fits China better than anywhere else. I mean, that seems to me to be the most successful one. Although the Chinese have their own very serious problem, in the housing sector and obviously problems in finding markets for all this stuff that they're producing. And this is just a huge issue. And obviously one of the questions of the contemporary period is whether, China is going to be able to construct an alternative geopolitical order to somehow step into the vacuum that's being left by the obviously disintegrating American hegemonic order. It's not at all clear to me that's something that they can really pull off. And the Europeans, it strikes me, are in a very difficult position, and I think their position is going to become more difficult as China unleashes a second round of kind of export-driven economic growth. So I think we're in for a very rough. I don't want to be, it's not my sort of purpose to be Debbie Downer here, but I just think that
that's my job.
Oh, that's your job. Okay, but the possibilities for a kind of a social democratic or state capitalist response to this they strike me as quite limited, actually.
Well, so can we get on to that? Unless Lee really insists on push on China, in which case I'll let him.
I think so. I agree. I think I do have to ask this question. So I agree with you that Bidenism ultimately failed. I guess the question, and I agree with you that we need more research on it. I'm doing some myself, but I don't necessarily have obvious answers to it, but it does raise the question about, did it fail for reasons that are contingent? So, the disposition of the Senate, or poor political strategy, or the inflation attendant on COVID lockdowns, or for reasons that are structural, that the state simply can't discipline capital to do what it wants to do. And I think the China angle is interesting here because it really presents the obverse case for your argument. So your argument is that industrial profits fall, and this causes capitalists to fail to invest in industry and to invest in assets instead. And this causes economic stagnation. Now, in China, that is not happening. In China, we see the rate of profit falling, massive surplus capacity, and yet still capitalists keep investing in productive investment, leading to even more surplus capacity and this massive surge of exports dumped on the rest of the world, right? Yeah. So the things that you just talked about. But underneath that arguably shouldn't be happening according to the logics that you foreground. Now, arguably, it happens because the Chinese government prevents capital flowing into speculative, non-productive outlets, right? So it's deflated the housing bubble in China, and it directs capital into industrial upgrading, manufacturing, and so on. But that suggests that the state can, in fact, be autonomous enough from capital in order to discipline it to serve political purposes. In this case, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation and the strengthening of China vis-a-vis the United States. So that suggests the capacity of the state to actually be significantly autonomous from capital. So that would suggest that the problem in the United States is a political problem, fundamentally, that we haven't yet found the political formula to impose disciplines on capital and to direct capital into industrialization. It can be done. The Chinese show that it can be done.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't disagree with much of what you're saying there. What I would say is that, and this might come as somewhat of a surprise to you, I'm quite open to the notion of political contingencies. But what I would say is I would point out a couple of things. One is that China's continuing ability to engage in this massive export drive is making the ability of every other state in the system to try to do that much more difficult, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
That makes it hard to see it as a model in that particular way. The second thing I would say is that I think it's not exactly a contradiction to say that, well, why are they continuing to invest even if profit rates are falling? I mean, the problem is that they're locked in to this strategy for a lot of reasons. And of course, you're right. They have a state that wants to promote industry because they have a state that actually wants to engage in industrial policy. But there is a lock-in mechanism. And the consequence of this is that over time, the problem will be exacerbated, right? The very success that they are having is going to exacerbate the problem of profitability, the problem of overcapacity, the problem, therefore, from the Chinese perspective, of finding outlets for their stuff. So just imagine if the US, in fact, successfully reproduced a Chinese model, which for a lot of reasons is mostly having to do with politics, is inconceivable. But if they somehow had done this, then we would be facing even greater pressure on profit rates, even more overcapacity, and arguably even greater levels of geopolitical tension. That's just a very long-winded way of saying the Chinese case is incredibly interesting, and I'm also very doubtful that it could be thought of as a kind of a reproducible model that could be exported across the world, because the very act of repeating that model would make the problems that it would meant to solve even worse. If that makes, that's kind of my view.
Yeah, no, and we might need to come back to that impossibility in just a bit. Now, we should turn to politics and the specific political impasses which you deal with in your writings. And I think it concerns two principal matters. One is the internal division of the American working class, and the other is the reality of politics in times of secular stagnation, which there is that politics always must be zero sum, that there is no win-win form of politics as there was under social democracy. So I guess turning to the first one, I think one of the most important contributions in your writings that we're kind of discussing here is your attempt to provide a materialist analysis of the divisions in the American working class, which are not culturalist ones, but are premised on an understanding of a material politics that is going on, which is premised on economic interest, but not class interest. And I think this is something which is worth elaborating on. So, if you could walk us through, firstly, your understanding of those divisions and the fracturing of the American working class, and secondly, or maybe in tandem with that, explain the difference between economic and class interest, because I think in a lot of left discussions, these two things get elided as if it's the same thing, and it gets elided. If I can make this comment, elided in a way from both sides. So there's an assumption that all material politics are ipso facto class politics, and if something is not a class politics, such as identity politics, that it is therefore not material at all, that there's no material grounding, that it's purely ideological or cultural. And in fact, you sustain that there can be economic politics, materialist politics, which are not class politics.
No, thanks for asking that question. So let me just take let me talk about what I understand as class in a general sense, and then talk about this other sort of issue. So if you're thinking about class in a Marxian sense, it's a very sparse model, and I think the sparseness of the model should be held on to, because once you start futzing with it, it becomes very unclear very quickly. But the basic idea is that classes form around the ownership and non-ownership of the major productive assets in society, right? And so as applied to a society like the US, what that means is, about 60 to 70% of the population is subsisting on wage income. And then then you have a few people who have their own businesses, and then you have a small group of people who are basically the owners of the major productive assets of the society. And so the class division is really between those two things, right? And so class interests are the interests that derive from the ownership or non-ownership of those productive assets, or what we say the ownership or non-ownership of property. But there's a lot of interests that people have that are material interests that are orthogonal in a sense to those interests. And most clearly are all of those interests that derive not from ownership or non-ownership of productive property per se, but of the particular positions that people hold in markets. And of course, that's Weber's territory, right? So you could say, this is where his insights are actually incredibly relevant, right? And the observation there, of course, with respect to, the observation is both with respect to capital and with respect to labor, but with respect to the working class itself, the observation is that people bring slightly different qualities of labor power to a labor market, and they engage in all kinds of strategies of defense and closure, what you call closure, to protect the price of their labor power. Unionism, we could say, is one of those, but there are many. There's racial and ethnic closure. There are forms of credentialing. There are many, many forms that workers engage in to defend the value of the asset that they bring to a market. Those interests are highly material, but they are not really, in the relevant sense, class interests, right? So once you have that kind of position, then you can understand what we mean by the difference between economic interests and class interests. Class interests are interests that are described in terms of ownership or non-ownership of property. And economic interests are, all the various interests that describe people's, positions in relationships in relationship to markets, right? You could say that in the case of sort of unions, and to the extent that a union is broad and industry-wide oriented, then market interests and class interests can begin to fuse together, but they by no means need to go together. Now, on that basis, then if we have that kind of general framework, and then you approach this whole question about culture versus economics, I think you see it in a different light, right? Because the point is that this is particularly relevant, I think, for countries like the US and Brazil, right? The point is that, actually, it turns out that, racial and ethnic differences are hardly merely cultural, if you wanted to put it that way, right? They have real consequences for people's ability to gain income for their particular form of labor power on the labor market. So that's kind of the general conceptual background. And then I could talk about how to understand this in terms of contemporary politics a little bit more as well. But I don't know how you wanted to sort of to think about this, Alex.
Yeah, well, I think so. How do we go about? Let's. I mean, maybe to kind of cut to the chase, because there's actually in a separate thing that you've written a blog post in Sidecar called First Principles, you argue that one of the ways past this is a conceptual purification, which would involve recognizing that workers as a whole aren't turning to the right so much as the fact that class is fundamentally fractured by these material interests in terms of market position, as you've just been describing. But you suggest that the way to get past this is not an appeal to simple economic interests or over the social or cultural ones. And I wonder if that's in contradiction to what you've just been saying now. And what kind of basis of universality might we then find? I mean, you gesture at a material politics that's at once specific and general, that recognizes people's kind of cultural specificities where they are, etc., as well as trying to provide something that's kind of general and universal on a kind of class basis in terms of non-ownership of the means of production. Do you have something in mind here? And I don't know if you want to try to apply this, but I mean, how would this play out with regard to questions of immigration or welfare, for example?
Yeah, I mean, look, let me just maybe I'll take the sort of slightly easier form of the question that you were putting forward there. This is obviously relevant to the problem of immigration. I mean, in particular, because immigration is hardly merely cultural, right? So
Yeah.
the thing that I think a lot of people on the left don't recognize fully enough is that restricting access to the labor market is a completely rational economic response to wage stagnation or to low wages, right? If you want to see the political power of anti-immigrant politics, it's enough to look at the behavior of those South Texas counties in the United States that all swung like 30 points in the direction of the Republicans during the last presidential election.
Yeah.
That, these
mainly
people,
Hispanic.
Mostly Hispanic. This was, these people wanted to get the labor market under control. I mean, that's kind of my general feeling about this. Not to say that there's not cultural stuff that goes along with that, but that's the basic sort of thing where that applies. The question about what class interest is and how to think about that, I think that the way I would say it is that the appeal to a class interest requires actually the at least sketching out of an alternative social order, which makes it very different from the appeal to market interests. One way of thinking about it, that go back to, if you go all the way back to Lukács, right? What's his central message? Class consciousness is a consciousness of class, meaning that coming to an understanding of one's class interests is at the same time coming to an understanding that one holds a specific kind of structural position in the whole society. And at the same time, coming to an understanding that we could have different kinds of societies, right? So this is why it's so difficult to achieve, right? Because the most immediate economic interests are those that are given on the market, and they're the most obviously appealable to, right? Class interests require, in order to be recognized and pursued, in my view, they really, really are rooted in the at least intuition that there's a different sort of society that is possible, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the trick. I wouldn't want to say too much more than that, but I would say that, and I would also say that this is also why, when we speak of the emergence of class interest or an awareness of class, it also requires us to understand that in the context of a specific state of class struggle. That is to say, it is not the case that classes have interests over which they subsequently struggle. It is the case that classes come to understand, and this is particularly true for wage earners, they come to understand their interests as a class in the context of a class struggle, one of whose major stakes is actually, what it's going to be, what the class interests are. So I'm sorry that I can't be more precise about that, or more, you could say, concrete, but I would just say that I think it's crucially important to see that class interests refer to interests in a particular type of society. They don't refer to people's immediate accessible market interests in the same way, which is why it's so hard to get them going.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and it would provide a good sort of riposte to left populism, or an understanding for why that might have failed, which was premised on a different distributional arrangement mediated by the state, and which was not class politics, and to a certain extent foundered on the reality of a fractured working class, in which people's maybe market position was that, I think, as I think we might come on to discuss, but you hint at the way that there are sections of the working class who would have an interest in, for example, higher profitability for their bosses, rather than necessarily greater welfare spending, which they might see as higher taxes, which would come out of their pockets, and therefore not actually advance their economic interest.
Look, sorry, I just wanted to say that just to kind of cut to the chase, I think that the appeal to economic interests without further clarification of what exactly we mean is highly ambiguous. It is quite possible to build a right-wing politics on the basis of an appeal to the economic interests of wage earners. Now, it's often not done, and certainly Trump isn't really doing it in the U.S. in the contemporary moment, but it is possible. I mean, I could imagine how that would work, and so that's just something that I think is really important for leftists to recognize.
I'm actually trying to think of examples from elsewhere in the world, and perhaps more outside of the core, where indeed there are more cases of right-wing right-wing politics that appeals to the economic basis of the working class. But
well, anyway, you will correct me, but Peronism might be an example, and you can think about social imperialism in the 19th and early 20th century. There are plenty of examples, but I think I just want to, this is quite an abstract discussion, and it might be helpful just to concretize it, because I think one of the most helpful contributions of your work has been to, apply this concretely to the American context, and to give quite a different analysis of the polarization in American society, and that is mirrored in many so-called advanced capitalist states. And I kind of want to just flag this for listeners, but also push you a bit on on whether it's possible to break out of this polarization. So the logic of your argument is that because of secular stagnation, there isn't enough growth to fund a welfare state, so that politics becomes zero-sum struggle over the economic pie, as you put it, between principally two working class fractions: a credentialed working class that defends expertise, technocracy, EDI bureaucracies, state spending, and so on, that kind of enlarges their world of work and flows of money to the things that they care about. And those people have moved towards the Democrats, or the kind of ex-social democrats in European countries. And then the non-credentialed nativist working class, who are principally low-skilled, low-pay workers, and they defend the value of their wage, their position in the market, as you put it, by wanting to exclude immigrants who compete with them, and they oppose redistributive policies aimed at minorities. And so those people have moved increasingly towards the right, or conservative parties. And I think it's a really helpful reminder, which one of the co-hosts of this podcast, George Hoare, has always said, although he likes the term professional managerial class, and we had this large argument about whether this is an appropriate term.
You say as if that's just one argument. It's an endless argument over a number of years.
But this is why this is such a kind of nice framework, because objectively, you can understand the working class is very large, defined by the fact that it has to work for a wage, but it is internally divided into class fractions, just as the capitalist class is. And these are two quite distinct positions. The so-called PMC would be the credentialed working class that has a distinct set of material interests. So we don't have to understand it as a separate class. It's just part of a working class, but these have separate material interests. Therefore, they have different politics. Now, I think that's really helpful and gets away from the kind of culturalist or political interpretations of these things by saying it's not so easy as to make appeals to people as members of a working class, or try to educate people to be more progressive, or whatever it is. It's like, actually, there are material interests at stake. But what I wanted to push you a bit on is, in line with what you said earlier on about the difficulty of, pursuing an industrial policy that might shift these coalitions, as someone like the Biden administration tried to do, you seem a little bit fatalistic, and I wonder where that kind of leads us. Isn't there a possibility of returning to some kind of a pro-growth politics that might shake this divide up a bit and build a bit more unity between these groups, or shake them up? We've also discussed on the podcast Perry Anderson's analysis of the political impasse we find ourselves at. He talks about this trifecta, the problems today of neoliberalism: oligarchy, international factor mobility, and inequality. And the right wants to talk about at least political oligarchy and factor mobility, i.e. immigration. But the populist left only wants to talk about oligarchy and inequality and don't want to touch immigration. So we're deadlocked. And another co-host of this podcast have said, look, there's a way that you can do all sides of the triangle, which is to, politically I'm speaking, appeal to the nation, appeal to some larger community and say, what is the national interest? It's to attack all sides of this triangle and break out of it. And there was some discussion on a recent episode we did on Muskism, that there could be, even at the next election, a kind of left populist abundance agenda that tries to do something like this. So you said earlier on that you favor political contingency, but on the other hand, it all seems quite doom and gloom and structuralist. So where do you sit on these questions? Is there a way out of the deadlock that we seem to find ourselves in today, or not?
Well, the difficulty is that here, so I mean, obviously, the honest answer to your question is that I really don't know, and then if anybody could figure out the way out, that would be great. I would endorse them. But the difficulty I see is that you need a politics that is operating at once at the sort of nation state level, and also at the international level, because of the things that we were talking about before. A series of disconnected national Keynesian projects, I think, is going to create a terrible and ultimately, or maybe not over the too long term, logjam among the different projects. In terms of that, I think that this business about that the left wants to focus on oligarchy and forgets factor mobility. I think that's true. I mean, really, when you're talking about labor mobility, I have a slightly different view about that, and it connects to this internationalism that I'm talking about. It strikes me that the problem, that the problem of the immigration problem can't really be solved at the level of immigration policies at the nation state level. It has to be solved at the level in which the policy really resides, which is this massive uneven development and geopolitical chaos, spread obviously in the European case, which is squarely at the Americans, doorstep. I mean, they've created this, through their policies in the Middle East and through failed development policies. So in some way, what I think has to be done is you have to tackle both sides of this thing. You have to tackle the international side and you have to tackle the national side. You have to do it at the same time. There's no going back. I just am very skeptical about the possibilities of national level social democracy in the current period. And I see a lot of, I mean, and I also think, I do see that in a way. I mean, if you think about a journal like American Affairs or something like that, there are some writers for those journals. I'm not including you in this, Alex, because I know you've written for them.
Well, yeah, and indeed, so has Lee. So
Lee has done it as well. I mean, there is a kind of uncomfortable convergence between, the social democrats of the right and whoever the social democrats, or I don't know, developmentalists, let's put it that way, of the left and developmentalists of the right kind of coming together. I'm very, very skeptical of that position, because I think it could lead to some very unattractive politics on the one hand, and I also think it's unworkable unless a new geopolitical order is also being instituted. And we may be at the moment where those things are possible, to get back to the issue of contingency. I mean, the question of what kind of geopolitical order is emerging has never been more open in my lifetime. I mean, it's something new is coming, and I guess the question is how to build that. But it needs to be built. The national level and the international level just have to work together. I think the left has really, has lacked an international vision for a long time, to be honest, and that I think is a huge problem.
Yeah, interestingly, perhaps very internationally oriented without an international vision.
Those are different things. Yeah, they're very different, I think.
I don't know where to go next, because at the risk of, we've gone for an hour 20 nearly, and there's possibility of opening it up and needing to continue for 2.5 hours, and I don't think we should do that. So should I maybe give you an opportunity at this point, unless Lee has something, a burning matter he wishes to pick up from that. Maybe I want to give you an opportunity, Dylan, to trail the book that you're working on capitalism and democracy, and I'm certainly interested to get a little preview of what it's about.
Sure. No, thanks for that opportunity. Basically, the book is a historical comparative study of capitalism and democracy, and the punchline of the book, if I could put it that way, is that the idea that capitalism and democracy have gone hand in hand is massively overstated. And my argument is essentially that those countries that sort of achieved democratic capitalisms before, we could say, the Second World War have really enjoyed exceptional advantages, and that they, in a sense, are the true, to use the German phrase, they're the Sonderweg cases. They're the particular paths. So places like the US, Britain, in a different way, France, and that there is a sense in which the typical path of a capitalist society is towards some form of rightist authoritarianism. And it's only if you break that tendency that you can get a functioning democratic capitalism. And then the book ends with a coda on what this means for the contemporary period. So that's more or less what I've been up to, struggling over these things for some time. But if you have me back on, maybe I can talk about it.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
No, very eager to do that. I'll bug you for a copy, for an advance copy, or your publisher for it in advance of coming out. But yeah, love to discuss that with you when the time comes. But thank you for your time today. I found this great.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Your guys' questions were fantastic, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So.
Excellent. Let's do more of it.
Great.
Cheers, Dylan.